So today I'm going to, thanks again, Wacoit and Kristen and the whole team, having my colleague Ben and me here. We are such a small region, and it's really important to learn from each other. And when we started our journey on sediment placement, we brought in Bart Wilson, who works with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. He had worked for their Delaware estuary program on a project, a sediment placement project that used spraying of sediment. So we were trying to learn from those who had done it. We reached out to Jamaica Bay down in New York City. So the key thing with this type of technique is learning from others in our region so we can share lessons learned and not repeat mistakes for this very intensive restoration technique. So this is a collaborative presentation. I worked on 2 of the sediment placement projects very closely with Caitlin Chafee, who used to be with Coastal Resources Management Council. That's our CZM agency. And with U.S. Fish and Wildlife's coastal program, with the local community. And the second project we worked on had funding from NOAA and Jim Turek, who just retired last year. So here are the 4 sites in our little state. The first one that was done was in 2016. Ben's going to be talking about that with upland material and Narrow River. A second U.S. Fish and Wildlife site was done in 2017 at the mouth of the Narrow River. And Ninigret was also in 2017. It's a back barrier marsh on one of our coastal salt ponds. And Quanaketag Salt Pond, we did a similar back barrier project 2 years later. So to say the least, we were quite busy for a few years there, and we're still adaptively managing those sites and monitoring those sites today. And here's just a close-up of the Ninigret and Quani sites. Those are adjacent to man-made breachways that aren't navigational channels. They should have been maintained, but we don't have a program in Rhode Island, which could be a county program because we're the size of a county. So it turned out that there was a lot of interest in dredging these channels, these breachways, for water quality and navigation. And it ended up that this team, led by Coastal Resources Management Council, we applied for funding after Hurricane Sandy through the Department of Interior to do the Ninigret project. So it was the salt marsh restoration project that funded the navigation, a navigation improvement project, but we took the material from the breachway and put it on a degraded marsh adjacent to the breachway. So these are just some facts on the project. I'm going to get more into logistics. Ben's going to talk a little bit more about the planning phases. So the Ninigret project was about 20 acres, 36,000 cubic yards of material. And the Quani project was on both sides of the breachway. We put sediment on degraded marshes and about a 30-acre site, just to give you a reference. And we worked with a team. This is the GIS coordinator from the town of Charlestown, where just like on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife projects, those restoration practitioners provided the engineers the growth range of the various salt marsh species, so we had that target elevation, and it was a collaborative effort to gather that information. And the engineer also took sediment samples for grain size, of course for contaminants. This was all clean material. This wouldn't be suitable for any material that is contaminated, but it was clean material, and this is the restoration project area at Ninigret Marsh. You can see the breachway to the east, and it was dredged from about here up. And the material was pumped through a hydraulic dredge onto the marsh platform. Our construction window, we had to be off the marsh by January 31st due to winter flounder spawning, and the contractor started sometime in December. So as Ken said, difficult time of year for doing dredging. And here's the marsh. This was a very degraded marsh. Here you get to see some of our high marsh habitat here, right there, that little Peyton's, surrounded by these subsidence basins, die-off areas, very poor quality salt marsh. So this was almost like building the marsh from the bottom up. We do not call this project was not thin layer placement. It was a large amount of material was pumped on the marsh in places 1 to 1.5 feet, depended upon the location. Here's the dredge. This was a dredging contractor out of Wisconsin. Here they used the hydraulic dredge in the breachway. They pumped it through this 8-inch pipe, and the pipe's heavy enough. Ken, I would assume you have to do this. To move the pipe, you actually have to have equipment because it takes a lot of force to move and strength to move those pipes. And then they had bulldozers getting the actual targeted elevation and grades. And then here's what the site looked like. Brennan was the name of the contractor. They got drone imagery immediately after. And you could see the bulldozer tracks. And this was January of 2017. And my colleague and I looked at each other like, oh, what did we get ourselves into? And one of the first days we were out there in February, post-sediment placement, the winds were blowing about 40. And you can imagine all that fine-grained sand was blowing across the marsh platform into a creek. It was filling in the creek as we just watched the wind blow the sand away. So we immediately started planting beach grass at a salt marsh restoration site as a tool for sand management. And this was a site that it was very difficult to access, so we would access it by boat or a 4-mile off-road vehicle trek. So we decided beach grass was a lot easier to deploy than fencing. And we also used just dead shrubs, anything to hold the sand in place to create these kind of windrows. And here are a couple piping plover using one of our little mini windrows. Within that was by early March, they were already using the habitat, some of the higher elevation areas. So the grading that the contractor did was initial grading. I want to make sure everyone understands when you do these projects at scale, like bringing in a lot of material, sediment placement is step one with regards to the restoration, and then restoring hydrology is a multi-year step 2. And I wouldn't call it adaptive management. It's the next phase of the restoration. So getting the grades right, really fine-tuning the grades, making sure that sediment ties into the upland edge so you don't have water getting kind of trapped on the upland edge of the sediment. That was a lesson learned. We were concerned about Phragmites encroaching the sediment placement project, so we kind of created a zone where the upper part of the marsh didn't get sediment, but what did we do? We just created an impoundment. So we had to ensure that we provided a flow path out for that groundwater from the back barrier beach, or we graded up to that upland edge. And the sediment also can be like quicksand if it's not appropriately graded. Then we restored hydrology over multiple years. Since it's sand moves, and we had lots of maintenance of those creeks that we dug. So a combination of larger creeks dug with the low ground pressure excavator, and then these smaller drainage features that we dug by hand. And we would plant along the drainage features with Spartina alterniflora to try to stabilize those banks to help prevent the creeks from filling in with sand. This just gives you an idea of the grading we did after the sediment was placed with the low ground pressure excavator. And then these are the creeks and I would say shallow runnels that we dug through the sand. A very different approach than hydrology restoration of an existing marsh, but as kind of the same idea, shallower features versus wider creeks that we were trying to dig to bring both fresh water from the upland out and salt water in. And at Ninigret, we did a lot of planting. And that's another lesson learned that Ben and I will share is don't do so much planting the first year. Because we had some real success. This is Disticlus, first year, August, 3 months after we planted it. It looks beautiful. It grew significantly from a 1-inch plug to those lovely plants, and then it coalesced, and here it is a few years later. But then we also planted these poor little Spartina alterniflora in this very highly anoxic soil, and of course the plants didn't survive. So the one thing we've learned is use the plants to work with your restoration goals, stabilize the sand, stabilize the banks of these creeks, but don't try to do wide-scale planting that first year because the site is so new and there's so much change, and ensuring that those plants have suitable areas for survival is key, because some of those lower elevation areas have very either hypersaline or anoxic soils to start. This is, oh, look, Danielle, you're in 2 of my slides here. So we had a huge team monitoring these sites. We wanted to learn as much as possible. Here are some of the partners. And Danielle at the time was a PhD student at URI. And so she was able to get at the bottom floor of the Quani project doing gas flux measurements, which was key because we didn't have that parameter monitored at the Ninigret project, but we worked with the EPA's Atlantic Ecology Division, our Narragansett Bay Estuarine Research Reserve, and URI, NRCS on monitoring a variety of parameters. Save the Bay did the vegetation, but it was a real collaborative effort. And our colleague Kenny Raposa published a paper in, when was that? I didn't write the date. I think that was 23, called Laying It On Thick, about the Ninigret project. He is also working on another paper with Ben and other colleagues on the 4 sediment placement projects to provide data now that many years out. And then this is just some aerial imagery of the Ninigret site pre and post. And here's some better on-the-ground shots from our photo stations showing kind of the moonscape after that first growing season, and then the second growing season and 7 years later. The higher elevation areas have definitely come back with Phragmites. There's a lesson learned as well. But we have seen, here's the bear and the drop-off of bear. Here's some of these early colonizer species. We had tons of colonizer species that have just now disappeared. Now we have Salicornia, but there was a whole variety of colonizer species. And then we're beginning to see an increase of the Peyton's, Juncus, and not as much Disticlus as this site, as well as the increase of Phragmites on the site. And this was a photo of a nest that Ben Gaspar found 2 years ago. This was an area we didn't plant. It just came back with Peyton's. And it was I think the first successful salt marsh sparrow nest he found on the site. And again, you can see the Phragmites in the background. So I want to make everyone aware that this site it certainly does not look just like this. We didn't get that Goldilocks zone of perfect Peyton's, but it's a combination, a mosaic of habitats. And last year they found even more salt marsh sparrow nests on the sediment placement project. And just briefly, we did the same thing at Quani, and applied some of those lessons learned. The breachway was dredged in this area, and here the sediment was placed on the west side and the east side of the breachway. We learned to kind of take a deep breath and not plant as much. We actually didn't do any planting on the west side and did some selective planting on the east. We also created a barrier spit with the excess material. Again, a mosaic of habitats, not just salt marsh. As Ken was saying, you could do tern nesting habitat. When we talked to Noah about this site, we discussed the goal of returning. There's a lot of horseshoe crabs that spawn in this area, but those little shallow beach areas are eroding away. So we created horseshoe crab spawning habitat. And last year I saw ruddy turnstones and a variety of shorebird species using that area. We also look at salinity when we're out there for adaptive management, wanting to ensure we provide flow paths. The blue areas, blue polygons are low salinity areas where groundwater is entering the marsh, and ensure you provide areas for, of flow path for that groundwater to try to prevent Phragmites from colonizing the marsh. And again, on this site, we had issues with sand management, but we had learned to have a plan, our backup plan of beach grass ready and able. We also learned to use these little peat dams here to try to capture the sand that's washing off the marsh or washing off the sediment placement area and filling in our channels. And I don't think, has anyone seen a Salicornia sand dune before? So the Salicornia was enough structure that it captured sand, and it literally created a little linear sand dune where the Salicornia was growing. So any structure provides an area for that sand to get captured. This was wind-blown sand filling in one of our drainage features after one winter. So very dynamic sites. And for Ken, that probably is similar to what you see. There's a lot of sand movement. This is the Quaney site. This marsh had almost completely been drowned. It was a pretty significant subsidence basin. And just with regards to the timeline for these projects, when you're, the first winter after sediment placement, expecting to do kind of that initial hydrology and restoration, you don't have that much time relative before the growing season. We did, I'd recommend limited salt marsh planting, and then plan for a whole nother year of hydrology restoration in year 2. And then more active maintenance year 3 through 5, and adaptive management and ongoing monitoring beyond. So it has been, going backwards. There we go. And then make sure you plan for, there will be predation by geese, and it's pretty much impossible unless you have a small site to fence off all these areas. We started with a fencing project on both all 3 projects, the first 3 projects we fenced, and those are very challenging to maintain. So kind of plan for geese predation, and that's something you have to realize, that these larger scale projects, you can't completely keep the geese from coming in and causing, feeding on the Spartina alterniflora. It looks like someone's been clamming out in the marsh. And then with regards to these higher elevation areas where Phragmites has gotten established, we are looking at ensuring that we have space for future marsh migration areas. So today, those areas are going to be a combination of Phragmites and Baccharis or bayberry. But in the future, this was about a tide that was equal to about 2 feet of sea level rise. That will be our future marsh. So it's okay to have a combination of elevations, and it makes it easier for an operator not to have to get to that perfect high marsh elevation. And then use the existing seed sources as your friend. These are Salicornia seedlings and Sueda linearis. There's so much seed out there, and in trying to make sure that you use what is available. It really helps you figure out for year 2 or 3 planting plans what can make it in these areas. And so that was something we learned at the Quaney Marsh, and in future projects we're really going to minimize the amount of direct planting and allow the recolonization to tell us where what selective planting we should do, if any. And then here are some of the species that have been using the habitat. Oh, and here are our shorebirds feeding on the horseshoe crab eggs on that barrier spit, as well as the salt marsh sparrows. And we've been working for the last 5 years with the Nature Conservancy down in Jersey. They have a beneficial use network for for restoration practitioners, and they haven't published it yet. They will, but they just developed these case studies. So we have 2 done for the 2 projects that I just mentioned, and then Ben just wrote 2 on the projects that U.S. Fish and Wildlife conducted. So we're trying to get information and lessons learned out about these restoration efforts, and time is up. Perfect. And this is how, there are so many partners, as Sarah said, on all of these projects, and volunteers and hardworking interns are the backbone of these projects as well. Thank you.